Good evening once again, beautiful viewer. Find a comfortable space. Let the noise of your world fade into the background. Perhaps take a moment to notice the time on the clock and the place on the map you are listening from. It is a good practice, a way to ground ourselves in the now before we let go and drift back across the centuries into a world of golden sand and blinding sun. A world where kings were not merely men, but gods walking among mortals. Tonight, we journey to the banks of the Nile to explore the strange, suffocating, and truly bizarre life of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh. We have an image of kings, men and women who wear crowns, who sit on thrones, who command armies and rule nations. But a king, in the end, is a person. They bleed, they fear, they are mortal. The ancient Egyptian pharaoh was something else entirely, something for which our modern language has no true equivalent. To his people, he was not a ruler chosen by the gods. He was a god chosen to rule. He was not a humble servant of the divine. He was a member of the divine family, a living, breathing deity temporarily dwelling on the earthly plane. And the life he was forced to lead was a strange and crushing performance, a sacred drama that began with his first breath and did not end even with his last. His existence was not a biography, it was a liturgy. To even begin to understand the pharaoh, you must first wrap your mind around a concept that underpinned the entirety of Egyptian civilization, a word that holds the weight of their cosmos, ma'at. We often translate this word as truth, or justice, or order. But these pale, simple terms are like trying to describe the sun with a single word. Ma'at was the fundamental, harmonious order of all creation, the perfect, fragile, and divinely ordained balance of the universe. It was the predictable rising of the sun in the east and its setting in the west. It was the life-giving, annual inundation of the Nile, which deposited the rich black silt upon which all life depended. It was the rhythm of the seasons, the boundary between the chaotic, lifeless red desert, the Deshret, and the fertile, orderly black land of the river valley, the Kemet. It was the force that kept the stars in their courses and the moral fabric of society from unraveling. Ma'at was the opposite of Isfet, chaos, injustice, and decay, and holding the entire, impossibly vast structure of Ma'at together, preventing the universe from collapsing into darkness, was the singular figure of the pharaoh. He was not a king who prayed to the gods for a good harvest. He was the cosmic engine whose own ritual purity and actions compelled the harvest to happen. He was not a general who asked for divine favor in battle. He was the living incarnation of the warrior god Horus, whose presence on the battlefield guaranteed victory. Every single morning, in a series of sacred and intensely private ceremonies, the pharaoh was believed to personally reenact the creation of the world, maintaining the sun god Ra's perilous journey across the sky and through the treacherous underworld. His daily life was not a series of political decisions. It was a series of metaphysical necessities. If he failed in his duties, if his heart was not pure, if a single ritual was performed incorrectly, the consequences were not a poor harvest or a lost battle. The consequences were apocalyptic. Ma'at would crumble. The sun would fail to rise. The Nile would either dry up, bringing famine, or flood catastrophically, washing away civilization. The forces of chaos, embodied by the monstrous serpent Apep who lurked just below the horizon, would overwhelm the solar bark of Ra and devour the light of the world, plunging all of creation into eternal darkness and non-existence. Imagine living with that weight. Imagine the crushing psychological burden of believing that your every action, your every private thought, your very state of being determined the fate of the entire cosmos. This was a form of power so absolute it becomes something else entirely, an unbearable, inescapable, and uniquely lonely divine responsibility. The pharaoh was the living vessel for the great sky god Horus, son of Osiris, while he lived. The moment he died, his divine essence, his Ka, would merge with Osiris, the god of the dead, and he would become the ruler of the underworld. His successor, his son, would then immediately become the new living Horus. It was a seamless, eternal cycle of divine power. His body, therefore, was not his own. It was a sacred vessel, a national treasure. His life was not his own. It was a ritual. And the rules that governed this divine existence, from the food he ate to the words he spoke, were stranger and more restrictive than any prison sentence. This divine status was absolute and literal. It was not the later European concept of the divine right of kings, where a monarch was merely God's chosen representative on earth. The pharaoh was not a representative. He was the god. This reality was reinforced every single day in the most important and secret ritual of the nation, the daily temple ceremony. Across Egypt stood great temples dedicated to the major gods: Amun-Ra at Thebes, Ptah at Memphis, Thoth at Hermopolis. These temples were not simple places of public worship. They were seen as functional models of the universe, and at the heart of each, in a dark, sealed chamber known as the Holy of Holies, stood a cult statue of the god. This statue was not an idol, a mere representation. It was believed to be a physical vessel that the spirit or life force, the Ka of the god, could inhabit. And only one person was permitted to enter that sacred space and interact with the god directly: the pharaoh. Every morning before dawn, the pharaoh, or a high priest acting as his official stand-in, would undergo a series of intense ritual purifications. He would be cleansed with sacred water from the temple's holy lake, his mouth rinsed with natron salt, his body anointed with oils. He would be dressed in pure white linen sandals and ceremonial robes. He would then approach the massive sealed doors of the sanctuary. No other human was allowed to pass this point. Breaking the clay seal, he would enter the darkness, the symbolic primordial chaos of creation before the first sunrise. He would light a torch, bringing light into the darkness, and approach the shrine containing the cult statue. What happened next was not an act of prayer, but an act of service. He was the divine son attending to his divine father. He would reverently open the doors of the shrine and awaken the god within. He would perform a ritual to purify the statue, cleansing it of the night's inertia. He would then remove the statue's clothing from the previous day and dress it in fresh, fine linen of different symbolic colors. He would anoint it with precious scented oils and perfumes. He would adorn it with jewelry: pectorals, bracelets, and collars of gold and lapis lazuli. Finally, and most crucially, he would present the god with a feast of food and drink: bread, beer, wine, meat, vegetables. This wasn't a symbolic offering. The Egyptians believed that the god's Ka would literally and spiritually consume the life force of the food, giving the deity the energy it needed to perform its own cosmic duties for the day, to keep the sun moving, the crops growing, the world turning. The pharaoh was literally refueling the divine machinery of the universe. After the god had eaten, the pharaoh would sweep the floor of the sanctuary, backing away and erasing his own footprints, before resealing the shrine to be left in peace until the next dawn. This ceremony, performed in its essentials in every major temple across Egypt every single day for thousands of years, was the pharaoh's primary job. It was more important than leading armies, more important than administering justice, more important than any act of governance. Because in the Egyptian mind, if this service was not performed, there would be no army to lead, no justice to administer, no Egypt to govern. The pharaoh was the sole intermediary, the only bridge between the human world and the divine realm. He was the one who maintained Ma'at through his intimate, daily service to the other gods who were his kin. This sacred duty permeated every aspect of his existence. His body was a divine instrument, and it had to be kept in a state of perfect ritual purity. The food he ate was subject to strict regulations, prepared in a sanctified temple kitchen to ensure it was not contaminated by any profane influence. The clothes he wore, made of the purest linen, were imbued with magical and symbolic power. Even the words he used were different. The pharaoh would often refer to himself using the majestic plural or in the third person, not out of arrogance, but because I, the personal self, was subsumed by we, the divine office. His very name was a sacred, protected entity. A pharaoh had at least 5 names, his titulary, each one connecting him to a different aspect of his divine power and his relationship with the gods. His birth name was kept secret for much of history, a precaution against its use in malevolent magic. Thus, the life of the pharaoh was a paradox. He was the most powerful man in the world, an absolute monarch with life and death power over millions. Yet he was also the least free. Every moment of his day was circumscribed by ritual and obligation. His every meal was a ceremony, his every public appearance a theological statement. He lived his life in a gilded cage of divinity, surrounded by priests who were both his servants and his wardens, ensuring that the performance of his godhood never, ever faltered. His personal desires, his private feelings, his individual identity, these were all secondary, perhaps even irrelevant to his cosmic function. He was not a man who happened to be a god. He was a god forced to endure the condition of being a man. And this bizarre foundational truth about his nature is the key that unlocks all the other weirdness of his life, from the strange tangled web of his family to the monumental obsession with his death. We have established the pharaoh in his cosmic loneliness, a god trapped in the fragile shell of a man, his every action a necessary ritual to keep the universe from collapsing. His was a life of profound isolation, separated from all of humanity by the sheer, unbridgeable chasm of his own divinity. But even a god needs a family. Even a divine king must produce an heir to continue the eternal sacred cycle of Horus succeeding Osiris. And it is here, as we step from the public temple into the gilded, perfumed, and suffocating confines of the royal palace, that we find the next layer of profound and structured weirdness. For if you are a living god, a being of pure, sacred essence, who on this earth is worthy of being your partner? Who is fit to carry the vessel for the next incarnation of a god? The answer to the ancient Egyptians was as coldly logical as it was, to our modern minds, deeply disturbing. No one but another god. And the only other beings on earth with the same divine blood flowing through their veins were in your own immediate family. The royal family of Egypt was not a family in any sense we would recognize today. It was a divine institution, a self-contained, self-perpetuating, closed loop of sacred energy. Its primary function was not love or companionship, but the preservation of its own celestial nature against the profane dilution of the mortal world. The solution to the problem of a divine marriage was, therefore, systemic and sacred incest. This was not a dirty secret whispered in the palace corridors, nor a moral failing to be hidden away. It was a cornerstone of state policy, a public and celebrated sacred duty, a theological necessity of the highest order. Brother married sister, father married daughter, uncle married niece. This was not seen as a transgression against nature. It was seen as the ultimate act of piety and the most perfect emulation of the divine. They were simply following the blueprint set for them by the gods themselves in the very stories of creation. The most central and beloved of all Egyptian myths was the story of Osiris and his sister wife, the great enchantress Isis. Osiris, the primordial king who taught humanity agriculture and law, took his own sister as his queen. Their union was presented as the ideal, a perfect, balanced partnership of divine power and complementary attributes. When Osiris was murdered and dismembered by their jealous brother, the chaotic god Set, it was Isis who painstakingly searched for and reassembled the pieces of her husband's body. Through her powerful magic and unwavering loyalty, she was able to posthumously conceive their son, Horus, who would grow up to avenge his father and reclaim his rightful throne. Horus was the prototype for every pharaoh who would ever rule. Thus, by marrying his own sister, the pharaoh was not breaking a social rule. He was meticulously reenacting this foundational sacred story. He was ensuring that the royal bloodline, the divine ichor of the gods, remained as pure, as potent, and as undiluted as possible. A child born of a mortal woman would be a demigod, a diluted being, and a potential weak link in the cosmic chain of Ma'at. Only a child of two divine parents could be a pure god, fit to rule. This practice also served a brilliantly pragmatic political purpose, creating a fortress around the throne. The pharaoh's power was absolute, but the world was not without threats. A powerful noble family from the provinces could amass wealth and influence. A foreign empire could seek to gain a foothold through a marriage alliance. By marrying exclusively within the immediate family, the pharaoh neutralized these threats before they could even form. If he were to marry the daughter of a powerful courtier or general, he would instantly elevate that entire family, creating a potential rival faction at the very heart of the palace, a group with a vested interest in the succession that could lead to intrigue and civil war. If he married a foreign princess from the Hittite Empire or the kingdom of Mitanni, he would be bringing alien influences, strange gods, and a potential political pawn for another king directly into his court and his bedchamber. The famous Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence from the 18th dynasty, are filled with letters from foreign kings begging the pharaoh for an Egyptian princess in marriage, a request that was always, and sometimes insultingly, refused. The pharaoh Amenhotep III flatly told the king of Babylon, "From time immemorial, no daughter of the king of Egypt is given to anyone." Egyptian princesses were too sacred to be sent abroad. The pharaoh, however, would gladly accept foreign princesses into his own harem, but they could never hold the supreme rank of great royal wife. That was reserved for a woman of pure Egyptian divine blood. By marrying his own sister, the power stayed perfectly contained. The wealth, the titles, the sacred authority, and the keys to the kingdom all remained locked within the singular entity of the royal house. It was a strategy of divine genetics and political consolidation rolled into one holy act. The most famous and most tragic product of this millennia-long system is a name known to the entire world: Tutankhamun. The boy king was not an anomaly. He was the predictable culmination of generations of this practice. The incredible scientific analysis of the 18th dynasty royal mummies, housed in the Cairo Museum, has revealed a startlingly tangled and claustrophobic family tree. His father was the revolutionary and so-called heretic king Akhenaten, who had moved the capital to a new city and attempted to transform Egypt's polytheistic religion into a monotheistic worship of the sun disk, the Aten. Tutankhamun's mother was not Akhenaten's famously beautiful great royal wife, Nefertiti. Instead, DNA proved his mother was another mummy, found in a side chamber of the tomb KV35 and known to us only by the sterile name, the Younger Lady. And this Younger Lady, the analysis definitively proved, was Akhenaten's full-blooded sister. Tutankhamun was the direct offspring of a brother-sister union. And when his time came to rule and produce an heir, who did he marry to continue the sacred line? His own half-sister, Ankhesenamun, who was the daughter of his father Akhenaten and his stepmother Nefertiti. This intense, multi-generational inbreeding, so carefully designed to preserve their divinity, had devastating physical consequences. It did not make them gods, it made them profoundly and painfully frail. The perfect, serene golden image of Tutankhamun from his burial mask belies a sad and agonizing reality. Comprehensive CT scans of his mummy have revealed a horrific catalogue of congenital ailments. He had a severe cleft palate and a slight bucktooth deformity. He had a dangerously curved spine, a condition known as scoliosis. He suffered from Köhler's disease, a painful bone disorder that leads to the death and collapse of bone tissue, specifically in his foot. His left foot was a clubfoot, permanently twisted inwards and downwards, making it impossible for him to place it flat on the ground. He would have been in chronic pain and would have been completely unable to walk without assistance. This is not speculation. His tomb, famously, contained over 130 ornate walking sticks and canes, many of them showing clear, unmistakable signs of heavy use, their handles worn smooth by his hand. He was not the golden boy god of our popular imagination, striding powerfully at the head of his army. He was a physically disabled young man, leaning heavily on a stick, the living embodiment of the catastrophic genetic cost of his family's quest for divine purity. The tragedy was compounded in the next generation. His two children with his half-sister Ankhesenamun were both stillborn daughters. Their tiny, perfectly mummified bodies were placed in miniature coffins and buried with him in his tomb, a silent and heartbreaking testament to a bloodline that had finally become too pure, too thin, too fragile to sustain itself. This was not a practice confined to a single, unlucky dynasty. The legendary Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, the archetypal pharaoh who ruled for an astonishing 67 years, fathered over 100 children and left his monumental stamp across the face of Egypt, was also a devout practitioner of royal incest. He had many wives, including several foreign princesses taken for diplomatic reasons, but his most beloved and important queen was the beautiful Nefertari. After her death, he elevated others to the preeminent position of great royal wife, and among them was Bintenath, his own firstborn daughter by another of his principal wives, Isetnofret. He would later go on to marry at least 2 more of his own daughters, Meritamen and Nebetawi. To Ramesses and his court, this was not a perversion. It was the highest honor he could bestow upon his own children. By making them his great royal wives, he was elevating them to the supreme rank a woman could achieve, allowing them to share in the full divinity of their father, not just as his offspring, but as his ritual and divine partner on the earthly plane. This strange system created a paradox. While it physically weakened the royal line, it gave the women of the pharaoh's family a status and power almost unimaginable in any other ancient society. The king's primary wife was not just a queen consort, a passive partner. She held a specific and powerful religious and political office, the Hemet Nesut Weret, the great royal wife. She was not merely the wife of the god, she was a goddess in her own right. She was the living incarnation of the goddess Hathor, the celestial consort of Horus, or Isis to his Osiris. In temple reliefs and statuary, she is often depicted at the same colossal scale as the pharaoh himself, a clear visual sign of her equal, though complementary, divine stature. She had her own vast estates, her own independent income, her own scribes and administrators, and her own crucial religious duties, performing sacred rituals in her own temples. It was through her, the vessel of pure divine blood, that the royal essence was passed to the next generation. The legitimacy of an heir depended not just on being the pharaoh's son, but on being the son of the great royal wife. Even more powerful, in some ways, was the king's mother. As the Mut Nesut, the mother of the king, she became the mother of the living god, Horus himself. This gave her a deeply revered status as a wise elder, a direct link to the previous pharaoh, and a figure of immense moral and political authority. Powerful queen mothers like Tiye, the wife of Amenhotep III and mother of Akhenaten, corresponded directly with foreign kings as an equal, her name appearing in diplomatic correspondence. They often acted as powerful regents for their young sons, effectively ruling Egypt from behind the throne. This status reached its ultimate and most audacious expression in the figure of Hatshepsut. Daughter of one pharaoh, great royal wife to her own half-brother Thutmose II, and then regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, Hatshepsut eventually decided that her divine blood was so pure and her claim so strong that she simply cast off the roles of queen and regent. She declared herself pharaoh, adopting the full 5-fold titulary of a king, having herself depicted in art with a male body and the traditional false beard of kingship, and ruling as a true and prosperous pharaoh in her own right for over 2 decades. To justify this unprecedented move, she commissioned a series of reliefs at her magnificent mortuary temple, Deir el-Bahri, that told the story of her divine birth, claiming that the supreme god Amun-Ra had visited her mother in the guise of her father and had personally sired her, destining her for the throne from birth. Beyond these roles, a royal woman could hold the unique and immensely powerful office of the god's wife of Amun. This was a priestly position of the highest order, particularly at the great temple complex of Karnak in Thebes, the religious heart of the empire. The god's wife was the divine, earthly consort to the supreme state god, Amun-Ra. This was not a merely symbolic title. She had a sacred duty to ritually arouse the god to ensure the fertility and prosperity of all of Egypt. In return for this spiritual function, she commanded immense wealth and temporal power, controlling a significant portion of the temple's vast agricultural estates, its workshops, and its treasury. The position made her one of the wealthiest and most influential individuals in the entire country, a power broker independent of the king himself. This role was typically granted to the pharaoh's unmarried daughter or sister, creating a separate, parallel female lineage of power. and ensuring the royal family's direct control over the rich and sometimes politically troublesome priesthood of Amun. The royal family of Egypt, therefore, was a world unto itself, a hothouse of divinity. It was a closed system, designed to guard a sacred fire, and incest was the mechanism that locked the doors. It was a strategy that created some of the most powerful and influential women in the entire ancient world, but it was also a biological dead end, a path that inevitably led to physical weakness, pain, and sorrow. The pharaoh's very blood was both the source of his divine claim and the seed of his human frailty. We have explored the pharaoh's cosmic burden, a weight so immense it could crack the pillars of the sky. We have journeyed into the strange, closed circle of his divine family, a hothouse of sacred incest designed to preserve a godly fire at the cost of human frailty. But the weirdness of the pharaoh's life was not confined to the silent, star-filled temples or the whispered politics of the marriage bed. It extended to the very air he breathed, the ground he walked on, the food he consumed, and every single person who was permitted to enter his orbit. His divinity demanded that he live inside a bubble of absolute ritual purity, a meticulously constructed and fiercely guarded reality where the profane, messy, and unpredictable nature of normal human life was kept at a permanent and unbreachable distance. His daily existence was a masterpiece of managed perception, a life lived entirely through layers of intermediaries, a performance so complete that it is difficult to know where the man ended and the god began. The pharaoh was, in theory, the ultimate font of all authority. He was the supreme judge from whom all justice flowed, the chief lawmaker whose word was scripture, the commander-in-chief whose presence guaranteed victory, and the high priest of every cult in the two lands. Yet, in practice, direct, unfiltered contact with the king was a near impossibility for any mortal. To approach the divine was a perilous and terrifying act, not to be undertaken lightly or without immense preparation. An entire, complex and rigidly hierarchical class of courtiers, officials, and priests existed for the sole purpose of serving as a human buffer between the god-king and the world he ruled. They were the interface, the translators of his divine will into practical action. At the apex of this human wall stood the most powerful official in the land, a man second only to the pharaoh himself, the vizier, the tiati. The vizier was not simply a prime minister. He was the pharaoh's eyes, his ears, and his hands. He was the chief executive of the entire state apparatus, the master of a sprawling bureaucracy of scribes that was the envy of the ancient world. His office, known as the Hall of the Vizier, was the central nervous system of the kingdom. He was the head of the judiciary, overseeing all the law courts of the land. He was the chief financial officer, managing the treasury and the vast system of taxation and redistribution that flowed from the national granaries. He was the minister of public works, organizing the massive labor forces, the legions of stonemasons, artisans, and laborers required to quarry stone, build the eternal pyramids, and raise the magnificent temples that were the architectural manifestation of Ma'at. Surviving texts, like the installation of the vizier, inscribed in the tomb of the 18th dynasty Vizier Rekhmira, provide a stunningly detailed job description. The vizier was instructed to rise each day before dawn to receive the daily reports from the keepers of the city gates and the provincial governors. He was to sit on his official throne on a raised dais to hear the legal petitions of any man, rich or poor, without showing anger. He was the living embodiment of impartial justice. Around his neck, he wore a golden chain with a small, exquisite pendant of the goddess Ma'at, a constant reminder of the cosmic principle he was sworn to uphold. When a common Egyptian had a legal dispute, a complaint about a corrupt local official, or a desperate plea for aid, they did not petition the pharaoh. The very thought would have been absurd. They travelled, perhaps for weeks, to the capital city to wait their turn and present their case to the vizier. It was the vizier who governed, who managed, who judged, allowing the pharaoh to remain aloof, a distant, awesome, and largely unseen presence, free to focus on his far more important cosmic duties of keeping the sun in the sky. This profound isolation, managed by the vizier at the state level, was replicated on a personal level by a legion of palace officials. The pharaoh did not simply walk from one room to another. His feet were considered too sacred to touch the common, profane ground. Within the palace and on ceremonial journeys, he was often carried aloft in a magnificent litter or portable throne, borne on the shoulders of high-ranking courtiers. When he did deign to walk during grand processions, the path before him would be ritually swept and purified. Special attendants, an elite cadre known as the fan-bearers on the right side of the king, would walk beside him, holding long, elegant handles topped with enormous ostrich feathers. These were not merely for cooling him in the blistering Egyptian heat, they were potent symbols of his divine status. The gentle breeze they created was seen as the breath of life, a divine aura that further insulated his sacred person from the stagnant, common air of the mortal world. His most intimate personal needs were attended to by a host of specialized officials with titles that sound profoundly strange to our modern ears, revealing a world where every mundane act was transformed into a sacred rite. There was the chief of the scented oils and pastes for the king's body, responsible for the daily anointing that kept the divine skin pure. There was the keeper of the king's wig, a master of the intricate coiffures that were a key part of royal regalia. The pharaoh's barber was a man of immense importance and unwavering trust, for to hold a razor of sharpened bronze or obsidian to the throat of a living god was an act freighted with terrifying spiritual responsibility. A single slip, a single drop of divine blood spilled, could be a cosmological disaster. These were not servants in our sense of the word. They were ritual specialists, their roles often passed down within designated families for generations, their loyalty tested and absolute. The pharaoh's royal sandal maker was a high-ranking courtier, sometimes even a son of a minor wife, because the sandals that shod the divine feet were imbued with immense symbolic and magical power. They were not just footwear, they were weapons of magical warfare. The leather or papyrus soles of the pharaoh's sandals were often meticulously decorated with bound images of Egypt's traditional enemies, a struggling Nubian from the south, a bearded Libyan from the west, a terrified Asiatic from the east. With every single step he took, the pharaoh was symbolically and ritually crushing the forces of Isfet, the chaos and disorder that perpetually threatened the sacred borders of his kingdom. Even the simple act of eating was a complex ceremony. The pharaoh almost always dined alone, or in the sole company of his great royal wife, the goddess consort. This was to prevent any mortal from witnessing the divine being in the vulnerable act of consumption. The food was prepared in a special, ritually sanctified palace kitchen by a team of chefs, overseen by the superintendent of the king's repast. Before any dish, a roasted duck, a slice of melon, a piece of bread from the finest Emma wheat was presented to the king. It was first tasted by a designated food taster. This was not just a pragmatic precaution against poison, though that was certainly a constant and terrifying concern. It was a ritual act to ensure that the food was worthy of being consumed by a god, that it contained no spiritual or physical imperfections that could introduce impurity into the sacred vessel of the pharaoh's body. The very language of the court was designed to reinforce this immense distance. One did not speak to the pharaoh. One was granted the rare privilege of speaking in the presence of the pharaoh. Courtiers and officials granted an audience would enter the throne room and immediately perform the full prostration, the kenu, touching their foreheads to the cool stone floor. They would never address the king directly or by his name. They would refer to him by a series of grand, formal, and reverential periphrastic titles. His Majesty, the Good God, the Lord of the Two Lands, the Son of Ra. They would refer to themselves in the third person as the humble servant of His Majesty, or simply this servant, and preface any statement with formulaic phrases like, "May it please the sovereign, my lord." To receive a word of praise from the king was the highest possible honor, a blessing from a god, an event so significant it would be proudly and meticulously recorded in one's tomb biography to be read by the gods and mortals for all eternity. To incur the king's displeasure was to face not just political ruin or execution, but a kind of spiritual annihilation, to become a non-person. The ultimate expression of the pharaoh's life-giving power was the ubiquitous phrase life, prosperity, health, which followed his name in all inscriptions. It was a constant reminder that he was the sole source of all well-being in the kingdom. This carefully constructed bubble of divinity had a profound and distorting effect on the pharaoh's understanding of the world. His knowledge of his own kingdom, its people, its problems was almost entirely second-hand, a curated reality filtered through the meticulously prepared reports of the vizier, his generals, his priests, and his provincial governors. His perception of his own people was that of a distant flock, a vast and abstract resource to be managed, a population whose dutiful labor built his monuments and whose collective piety sustained his divine cult. When the pharaoh did appear in public, it was during grand, highly choreographed religious festivals, like the glorious Opet festival at Thebes or the Sed festival, his royal jubilee. During these spectacular events, he would emerge from the temple, not as a man, but as a living icon. He would be borne in a golden shrine on the shoulders of his priests, his face a serene and impassive mask, his body glittering with so much gold and so many jewels that he seemed to radiate his own light. The common people would line the processional ways, chanting, singing, and weeping, desperate to catch a single glimpse of their god-king, to feel the radiance of his presence, which was believed to have a tangible healing and protective power. For them, he was not a person, he was a force of nature, as fundamental and as distant as the sun or the Nile. This profound isolation was both a source of immense power and a critical, fatal weakness. While it elevated the pharaoh to an almost untouchable, superhuman status, it also made him incredibly vulnerable to the intrigues of the very people who formed his protective inner circle. A conspiracy within the palace among his own ambitious family members, his competing wives, or his highest officials was the greatest and most insidious threat he faced. The god-king was a prisoner in his own palace, a fly trapped in the amber of his own divinity. The most famous and chilling example of this vulnerability is the harem conspiracy that ended the life of the great Ramesses III during the 20th dynasty. Surviving court documents, known to us as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, tell the story in shocking detail. One of the king's secondary wives, a woman named Tiye, plotted with other women of the harem and high-ranking officials, the chief of the treasury, a general, several royal butlers, to assassinate the pharaoh and place her own son, a prince named Pentuer, on the throne, bypassing the designated heir. Their methods reveal the Egyptian worldview in stark relief. They did not just plan to use a dagger, they employed powerful black magic. The documents describe how the conspirators created wax figurines of the king and other courtiers, and obtained a magical book of spells from the royal library itself, using these forbidden arts to inflict pain and to weaken the divine protection that surrounded the pharaoh. The conspiracy was ultimately discovered, and the plotters were arrested and put on a public trial. The papyrus grimly lists their names and their fates. Many were executed. Others, of higher rank, were left to themselves in the courtroom, where they were forced to take their own lives to avoid the shame of a common execution. The Prince Pentuer was among them, but the documents contain a terrible, subtle clue. They refer to the king in the past tense as the Great God, a title reserved for a deceased pharaoh, suggesting the plot ultimately succeeded. For millennia, this was just a suggestion. But a modern CT scan of Ramesses III's mummy revealed the horrifying truth. A deep, lethal slash across his throat, more than 2 inches wide, had been expertly hidden for 3,000 years by the mummy's thick linen bandages. The God King, for all his ritual protection, his fan-bearers, his food tasters, and his divine status, was murdered by the vipers he kept in his own nest. His sacred isolation had made him a blind prisoner, unable to see the dagger that was being sharpened just beyond the veil of his own suffocating divinity. We have seen the pharaoh as a cosmic pillar, a divine prisoner in a gilded cage, and the head of a sacredly incestuous dynasty designed to fence in the divine. We have peered into his daily life, a world of ritual purity so absolute that it often blinded him to the dagger at his own throat. Now we must turn our attention to one of the most uniquely Egyptian, most deeply strange, and most ruinously expensive aspects of his entire existence, his overwhelming, lifelong, and all-consuming obsession with death. For a modern mind, death is an end. It is a tragedy, a loss, a final curtain falling on the stage of life. It is the cessation of being. For the Egyptian pharaoh, death was none of these things. It was not an end. It was merely a transition. It was a perilous, terrifying, and labyrinthine journey that led not to oblivion or a shadowy half-existence, but to his true, eternal, and ultimate destiny as a fully realized god. And the meticulous, fantastically complex, and mind-bogglingly expensive preparations for this journey were the most important work of his entire life. A project that began the day he took the throne and ended only when his last breath was drawn. From the very moment a pharaoh ascended to the throne of the living, becoming the new incarnation of Horus, he initiated the monumental task of preparing for his ultimate transformation into the eternal Osiris, lord of the underworld. This was not a morbid preoccupation born of fear. It was the ultimate act of upholding and ensuring Ma'at. The king's successful navigation of the treacherous paths of the Duat, the Egyptian netherworld, and his triumphant rebirth as a god among gods was absolutely essential for the continued stability of the cosmos. If he should fail this journey, if his spirit, his Ba, was ensnared by the demons of the underworld, or his heart was judged to be heavy with sin and devoured by the monstrous Ammit, the eternal cycle of succession would be broken. The chain linking the earthly realm to the divine would snap, and chaos would be unleashed upon the world. Therefore, the construction of his tomb, his Jet, or House of Eternity, and the stocking of it with every conceivable magical and material good he would need for the next life, was not a personal project of vanity. It was a national security imperative of the highest possible order, a sacred duty to his people and to the universe itself. This colossal project first took the form that has defined ancient Egypt in the global imagination: the pyramid. The great pyramids of the Old Kingdom, particularly the magnificent and awe-inspiring trio on the Giza Plateau, are the most famous and enduring symbols of the civilization, yet they are often profoundly misunderstood. They were not just extravagant gravestones or monuments to a tyrant's ego. In the Egyptian worldview, they were functional pieces of spiritual technology. They were resurrection machines. They were launch pads for the soul, meticulously designed, astronomically aligned, and magically activated to facilitate the king's rebirth into the celestial realm. The very shape of the pyramid, a perfect, four-sided, triangular form, was a multi-layered and potent symbol. It was a solid, petrified version of the sun's rays shining down through a break in the clouds, forming a literal, tangible ramp or stairway upon which the deceased pharaoh's spirit, his could ascend directly into the sky to join the imperishable ones, the circumpolar stars that never set and were considered to be the souls of the immortal gods. It was also a representation of the Benben, the primordial mound that first emerged from the chaotic, formless waters of Nun at the dawn of creation. By being buried within this shape, the pharaoh was placing his physical body back at the very scene of creation itself, positioning him to be reborn with the rising sun each morning for all eternity. The construction of a pyramid was, without question, the single largest and most complex national project a pharaoh of the Old or Middle Kingdom would ever undertake. It required a level of logistical organization, resource management, and sheer mathematical genius that was staggering for the ancient world and remains a source of scholarly debate and public fascination to this day. It mobilized a significant portion of the nation's workforce. Tens of thousands of workers were conscripted for the task. These were not, as the popular but inaccurate myth holds, miserable foreign slaves toiling under the brutal lash of an overseer. They were, for the most part, free Egyptian farmers and laborers. They were conscripted for a period of service each year during the Akhet, the season of the inundation of the Nile. During these months, their own agricultural fields were submerged under the floodwaters, making farm work impossible. This period of royal labor was their form of national service, their tax paid in sweat and muscle. It was a sacred duty, building the eternal home of their god. These workers were housed in purpose-built cities near the construction site, like the remarkable settlement excavated near the Giza pyramids. This was no mere labor camp. It was a marvel of ancient urban planning, a fully functioning city with streets, houses, administrative buildings, and massive food production facilities. Archaeologists have unearthed bakeries and breweries on an industrial scale, complete with large ovens and vats, capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread and jugs of beer, the staple currency and sustenance of the Egyptian diet, every single day to fuel the immense workforce. They were also provided with high-quality protein in the form of fish and meat, and given access to medical care, as evidenced by skeletons showing healed bones and even amputated limbs. This was the original company town, a stunning testament to the pharaoh's ability to command and care for his people, all in the service of one man's afterlife. The sheer scale of the labor involved is difficult for the modern mind to fully comprehend. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, the largest of the Giza group, is composed of an estimated 2.3 million individual blocks of stone. Most of these limestone blocks weigh an average of 2.5 tons, the weight of a large SUV. But the massive granite blocks used to construct the roof of the king's chamber, deep within the pyramid's core, weigh up to 80 tons each. These granite monoliths were quarried in Aswan, over 500 miles to the south, painstakingly hewn from the bedrock using simple stone pounders and wooden wedges. They were then loaded onto massive barges and floated down the Nile during the inundation before being dragged across the desert on giant wooden sledges to the construction site. There, they were shaped with astonishing precision using simple copper chisels and stone hammers, and then somehow raised, layer by layer, to a final height of nearly 500 feet. The logistics of feeding and housing the workers, the mathematics of the pyramid's perfect astronomical alignment to the cardinal points, the sheer human effort involved in moving and placing the stones. It represents a mobilization of national will that is almost unparalleled in human history, all focused on one singular, sacred goal, launching the king's soul into eternity. As the great house of eternity rose on the west bank of the Nile, the land of the setting sun, and thus the land of the dead, a parallel effort was underway to furnish it for its divine occupant. The pharaoh's tomb was not meant to be a sad, empty memorial. It was a functional eternal home, an exact replica of his earthly palace, but perfected and made permanent. Everything he enjoyed or used in his life on earth, he would need in the afterlife, but in an eternal, magical form. The tomb would be filled with exquisite furniture, gilded beds with legs carved like the powerful paws of lions, ornate chairs and stools inlaid with precious ivory and ebony from distant lands, and chests filled with the finest, gossamer-thin linen clothing. Entire sets of dishes, bowls and jars, crafted from precious and beautiful materials like lustrous calcite, hard diorite and gleaming gold, were stacked in the tomb's storerooms. Board games like the popular game of Senet, a game whose very name meant passing, were included for his eternal recreation, the game board itself being a map of the journey through the underworld. Every conceivable need was anticipated. Even the king's portable toilet seat was sometimes buried with him. Food and drink were provided in unimaginable quantities, meant to magically sustain him for millions of years. Hundreds, even thousands of large pottery jars of wine and beer were stored in the tomb, each meticulously labelled with an ink docket recording the vintage, the vineyard or brewery of origin, the quality and the name of the chief vintner, just like a modern fine wine cellar. There were containers of preserved meats, mummified ducks, geese and prime cuts of beef, and vessels filled with honey, dates, figs and other delicacies. But it was impossible to store enough physical food for eternity. So the walls of the offering chapel were covered in vibrant painted reliefs depicting endless processions of servants bringing every kind of food and drink imaginable. The Egyptians believed that through the recitation of a magical offering formula, these painted images would be magically transformed into their real-world counterparts, providing a perpetual source of sustenance for the pharaoh's ka, or life force. The tomb also had to be staffed. Small, magical figurines called shabtis or ushebtis were included for this purpose. The Egyptians imagined the afterlife, the field of reeds, as a perfect utopian version of Egypt, but a place where even the gods and the deceased king could be called upon to perform manual labor. like tilling the fields or maintaining irrigation canals. The Shabtis, inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, were designed to answer this call on the king's behalf. The spell reads, "O Shabti, if I be summoned to do any work which is to be done in the realm of the dead, you shall say, 'Here I am.'" A wealthy private individual might be buried with a few Shabtis. A pharaoh like Tutankhamun, however, was buried with 413 of them, a full staff comprising one for every day of the year, plus 36 overseers to manage them. But the most important items in the tomb were not the material goods, they were the magical ones. The walls of the burial chamber and the long corridors leading to it were covered from floor to ceiling with sacred magical texts. In the pyramids of the Old Kingdom, these were the pyramid texts, a compilation of hundreds of spells and incantations written in finely carved hieroglyphs. They formed a divine instruction manual, a celestial GPS, a roadmap for the deceased king's spirit. There were spells to protect him from the myriad dangers of the underworld, venomous snakes, giant crocodiles, and knife-wielding demons that lurked in the darkness. There were spells to help him navigate the treacherous paths and the series of locked gates, each guarded by a terrifying entity that required a specific password. There were spells to enable him to transform his spirit into powerful creatures, like a swift falcon or a cunning serpent, to overcome any obstacle. And there were spells to allow him to successfully present himself before the tribunal of the gods for the final judgment, the weighing of the heart, and be declared Ma Keru, true of voice, and worthy of eternal life. Reading these texts is like reading the pharaoh's private, magical script for the greatest and most dangerous journey of his existence. He would not just be buried, he would be armed to the teeth with divine knowledge, a walking encyclopedia of magical power. This entire colossal effort, the pyramid, the furnishings, the spells, was all a prelude to the final, crucial act, the sacred science of mummification. The 70-day ritual of preserving the pharaoh's body was designed to achieve something miraculous, to halt the natural process of decay and transform the frail, corruptible flesh of a man into the eternal, unchanging, and divinely perfect body of a god. The goal was to make the body a recognizable and permanent home for the king's spirit entities, his Ka, life force, and his Ba, personality, soul, which were believed to separate from the body at death but would need to reunite with it each night to achieve eternal life. This sacred and secret process was carried out by highly trained ritual specialists in a special workshop called the Wabet, the place of purification. First, the brain, which the Egyptians considered to be unimportant stuffing, the source of mucus, was removed. A long, hooked bronze instrument was carefully inserted through the nostrils, breaking through the thin ethmoid bone into the cranial cavity. The brain was then scrambled into a semi-liquid state and drained out through the nose. Then, using a razor-sharp blade of Ethiopian obsidian, a ritual incision was made in the left side of the abdomen. Through this cut, the embalmers would reach in and remove the internal organs, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the lungs, as these were the parts of the body most subject to rapid decomposition. Only the heart, the IB, was left in place. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and the conscience, a physical record of all the deeds of a person's life. The king would need it for the final judgment, when it would be weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at. The removed organs were not discarded, they were considered sacred and were preserved separately. They were individually cleaned, dried in natron, and wrapped in linen strips, and then placed in 4 special containers known as canopic jars, whose lids were carved in the shape of the 4 sons of Horus, the divine protectors of the viscera. The now empty body cavity was then thoroughly washed with palm wine, which acted as an antiseptic, and rinsed with a mixture of fragrant spices. The next, and most crucial step, was complete dehydration. The body was packed inside and out with heaps of natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, harvested from the dry lake beds of the Wadi el Natrun. For 40 long days, the body sat buried in this salt bath, which drew out every last drop of moisture from the tissues, killing bacteria and preventing decay. After 40 days, what remained was a desiccated, shrunken, and leathery husk. The body was then taken to be washed and purified one last time. The sunken skin was carefully anointed with a series of precious oils, waxes, and resins to make it more supple and give it a pleasant scent. The hollowed-out torso was then stuffed with linen packets, sawdust, and other materials to give it a more full and lifelike shape. The final stage was the wrapping. This was a complex, ritualized process that could take over 2 weeks. Hundreds and hundreds of yards of the finest linen strips, some no wider than a finger, would be meticulously wound around the body, part by part, limb by limb. Magical amulets, like the powerful scarab beetle, symbol of rebirth, the ankh, symbol of life, and the wedjat eye, the eye of Horus, symbol of protection and healing, were carefully tucked into the layers of bandages at specific, magically significant locations, forming a protective spiritual armor around the king. Priests of the Overseer of the Mysteries would recite spells and incantations from the Book of the Dead with each layer of wrapping. Finally, a breathtaking golden portrait mask was placed over the head and shoulders, providing a perfect, eternal, idealized face for the king's spirit to recognize. The mummified body, now called a sar, was no longer a corpse. It was a divine statue, a permanent, incorruptible vessel for an eternal soul, finally ready for its journey home. The House of Eternity was built. The sacred mummified body, the sar, was wrapped and sealed within its golden sarcophagus. The tomb was filled to the bursting point with every conceivable provision for the next life, a perfect, static, and eternal palace awaiting its divine occupant. Now came the final, spectacular, and deeply strange public performance of the pharaoh's life, his funeral. This was not a somber, mournful affair in the modern sense. It was a dynamic, loud, and theatrical piece of ritual magic, a carefully choreographed state event designed to actively propel the deceased king across the dangerous threshold between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. It was a national rite of passage, and every element of it, from the weeping of the mourners to the breaking of pottery, was a necessary step in the great cosmic transaction. The funeral procession began on the east bank of the Nile, the land of the living, typically at the king's palace or the embalming workshop. It was a grand, theatrical parade, a mirror image of the festival processions the king had led in life. At its head was the mummy of the pharaoh himself. He was not laid in a simple hearse. His magnificent nested coffins were placed within a large gilded shrine, which was in turn set upon a funerary sledge, a type of sled designed to be pulled over the ground. This sledge was often shaped like a sacred boat, the Neshmet bark, for the journey to the afterlife was conceived as a voyage across celestial waters. The sledge was not pulled by horses or oxen, animals considered too profane for this sacred task. Instead, it was pulled by a team of high-ranking officials and nobles, the companions of His Majesty, and sometimes by a pair of specially chosen white oxen, symbols of purity and power. To pull the sledge of the dead king was a final act of loyal service and a great honor. Following directly behind the pharaonic sarcophagus was a procession that displayed the sheer wealth and power he had commanded. Servants, their bodies dusted with dirt in a sign of mourning, carried the finest of his funerary goods aloft for all to see. Golden chariots, ornate furniture, chests filled with jewelry, and his royal insignia. This was both a display of his status and a confirmation to the populace that their god-king was being sent into the afterlife properly equipped. Then came the high priests of the major cults, robed in leopard skins, wafting clouds of pungent incense from long-handled censers and sprinkling libations of milk and water to purify the path. But the most striking and, to our eyes, most bizarre part of the procession was the professional mourners. These were not the grieving family members, but troops of women, hired for their theatrical skill. Their role was to perform an extreme, public, and ritualized display of grief. They would beat their bare chests, tear at their clothing until it was in rags, and throw dirt and dust over their heads and bodies. They would wail, shriek, and cry out in a high-pitched, ululating keen, their hair disheveled and their faces streaked with tears. This was not uncontrolled hysteria. It was a required performance. Their loud, unrestrained grief was believed to be a magical stimulant. It was meant to echo the primal sorrow of the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, who had mourned their murdered brother Osiris with such intensity that their cries helped to bring about his magical resurrection. By reenacting this divine mourning, the professional mourners were helping to power the pharaoh's own rebirth. The quiet, dignified sorrow of the royal family, who walked in a separate, more sedate group, was not enough. The funeral required this loud, chaotic, and performative grief to make the magic work. The procession snaked its way through the streets to the bank of the Nile, where a flotilla of boats waited. The mummy, still in its shrine, was loaded onto a magnificent funerary barge. It was accompanied across the river by two other boats, one carrying a group of priests and another carrying the professional mourners, who continued their loud lamentations throughout the crossing. On one of these boats stood two women, chosen for their beauty, who played the specific roles of the divine sisters, Isis and Nephthys. They were the chief mourners, the focal point of the ritual grief. The journey across the Nile from east to west was itself a profound symbolic act. It was a crossing from the land of the rising sun and the living to the land of the setting sun and the dead, a physical reenactment of the king's journey into the underworld. Upon reaching the west bank, the procession reformed and began the slow, arduous journey up into the desert hills towards the tomb, a dark, silent opening carved into the rock face of the Valley of the Kings, or at the base of the gleaming pyramid. As the sledge was dragged up the causeway, a ritual dance was performed by a troupe known as the Mu dancers. They wore tall, distinctive headdresses of woven reeds and performed a strange, swaying dance, believed to have originated in the distant past, perhaps as a welcoming rite for a returning chieftain. In the funeral context, their dance was thought to magically open the way to the netherworld, acting as spiritual ferrymen at the border between the two realms. At the entrance to the tomb, the procession halted. The sarcophagus was raised to a vertical position, facing the mourners as if it were alive. Now, the most crucial and mysterious ritual of the entire funeral was to take place. The opening of the mouth ceremony, the uprow. This was the magical act that would reanimate the mummified body, restoring its senses so that the pharaoh's spirit could see, hear, speak, eat, and breathe in the afterlife. The new pharaoh, the deceased king's son and successor, often took the role of the officiating Sem priest. Dressed in the sacred leopard skin, he would approach the mummy and, using a variety of specially designed ritual instruments, he would symbolically touch the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the golden mask. The most important of these instruments was the adze, a type of cutting tool, and a pesish kef, a strange fish-tailed blade of obsidian or meteoric iron, a material believed to have come from the gods in the sky. As he touched the mummy's face with each instrument, the priest would recite a series of powerful spells. "I open your mouth for you," he would chant. "I open your eyes for you. I open your ears for you, that you may speak, that you may see, that your heart may be in your body for you." The ceremony was a ritual reenactment of the moment the god Horus opened the mouth of his dead father Osiris, restoring his life. Through this act of sympathetic magic, the new king was not only reviving his father, he was also affirming his own legitimacy as the new Horus, capable of performing the most sacred rites. Offerings of food, most importantly the foreleg of a freshly sacrificed calf, were then presented to the opened mouth of the mummy, the first meal for the newly reanimated spirit. After this final, powerful act of animation, the sarcophagus was at last carried down the long, sloping corridor into the tomb, through chambers filled with funerary goods, until it reached the burial chamber, the Hall of Gold. Here, it was placed within a series of nested shrines and a large stone sarcophagus, which was then sealed. The priests would back out of the tomb, sweeping away their footprints as they went, and the entrance would be sealed with massive stones and plastered over, stamped with the seal of the royal necropolis, a jackal, the god Anubis, crouching over 9 bound captives. The god-king was now locked away in his eternal darkness, ready for his solitary journey. But the funeral was still not over. Outside the sealed tomb, the mourners would gather for the funerary banquet. This was a feast held in the presence of the dead, a final meal shared with the departed king. It was a boisterous and sometimes drunken affair, a celebration of life in the face of death, and a way of reaffirming the bonds of the community. The leftovers from this feast, the pottery shards from the broken vessels, and the remnants of the embalming process were then gathered up and buried in a pit near the tomb. This was not just a matter of cleaning up, it was a ritual act to ensure that nothing connected to the king's divine body was left in the profane world where it could be used in malevolent magic. Finally, the period of official national mourning would end. The heir, whose legitimacy was now sealed by the proper burial of his father, would assume the full duties of the kingship. The strange, weeping women would go home. The priests would return to their temples. But the king's journey was just beginning. Alone in the silent, star-painted darkness of his tomb, he now had to face the terrors of the underworld, armed with the spells on his walls and the amulets on his body. And for his family and his cult, a new eternal duty began: the perpetual presentation of offerings and the recitation of prayers at his mortuary temple, a process designed to feed and sustain his spirit for millions of years. The funeral was not a final goodbye, it was the beginning of an eternal conversation. The tomb is sealed. The final mournful wail of the professional mourners has faded into the desert silence. The pharaoh, entombed in layers of gold and impenetrable darkness, has begun his solitary and perilous journey through the star-strewn labyrinth of the underworld. For any other monarch in the annals of history, this would be the definitive end of the story, the final chapter in their earthly biography. But for the Egyptian pharaoh, this was not the case. His influence, his spiritual needs, and his divine presence remained a powerful, tangible, and relentlessly demanding force among the living. The dead king was not gone. He had simply relocated to a more powerful and permanent address. And this fundamental belief led to the creation of one of the most enduring, complex, and economically significant features of Egyptian civilization: the creation of a vast, permanent, and astonishingly well-funded industry of death. The pharaoh's afterlife required a dedicated C-suite of executives, a permanent staff of ritual specialists, and an enormous financial endowment to manage his eternal estate. He had become a dead god, but he was also the chairman and CEO of his own perpetual, tax-exempt corporation. This divine corporation was the Royal Mortuary Cult. It was an institution centered around a new, magnificent temple built specifically for the worship of the deceased king. This temple was emphatically not the tomb itself. The tomb was a secret, sealed, and magically protected place, ideally hidden away from the world in the desolate desert cliffs, its location known only to a trusted few. The mortuary temple, by contrast, known in Egyptian as the HWT, NNHHT, the mansion of millions of years, was a very public, grand, and accessible institution, strategically located on the edge of the fertile cultivation, forming a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. In the age of the pyramids, these mortuary temples were situated directly adjacent to their respective pyramids, connected by a long, covered causeway that led down to a valley temple at the water's edge. In the New Kingdom, when the kings were buried in the secret, rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings, these temples were built on an even grander scale, forming a stunning, miles-long necropolis-edge row of sacred architecture along the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. This street of temples included such world-renowned structures as the terraced temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri, the colossal Ramesseum of Ramesses II, and the temple of Medinet Habu, built by Ramesses III. These temples were not places of sorrowful remembrance. They were vibrant, bustling, and powerful divine engines. They were designed with one primary, practical purpose: to perpetually generate the spiritual energy through the ceaseless performance of ritual and the presentation of offerings that the dead king needed to survive and thrive as a fully realized, Osiris-like god in the afterlife. The core of this divine engine was the daily offering ceremony, a practice that meticulously mirrored the daily service performed for the great cosmic gods like Amun-Ra or Ptah in their own state temples. Every morning, noon, and evening, a dedicated team of priests, known by the specific title Hemka or Servants of the Ka, would undergo ritual purification and enter the mortuary temple. They would proceed through a series of courtyards and halls, their path growing progressively darker and more sacred until they reached the inner sanctuary. Here, in a space forbidden to all lay people, stood at least one life-size statue of the deceased pharaoh, often carved from precious hard stone like granite or granodiorite. This statue was not just a portrait. In the Egyptian mind, it was a functional vessel, a magically activated body double that the king's ka, his disembodied life force or vital essence, could inhabit in order to receive sustenance from the earthly realm. The priests would perform a miniature version of the opening of the mouth ceremony, purifying the statue with consecrated water from the temple's sacred lake, clothing it in fresh, fine linen, anointing its head with sacred oils, and daubing its eyes with cosmetic paint. They would then present it with a magnificent feast of bread, cakes, beer, wine, cuts of beef and poultry, fruits, vegetables, and burning incense. The aroma of the incense was believed to be the scent of the divine, and the smoke was a medium that carried the essence of the prayer to the heavens. The food offered at the king's altar was real, often in enormous quantities, but how could a single temple provide 3 full, lavish meals a day, every single day, for all eternity? This practical question led to the creation of a sophisticated and self-sustaining economic system that underpinned the entire pharaonic state. Upon his accession to the throne, a pharaoh would legally endow his future mortuary cult with a massive, permanent, and, crucially, tax-exempt grant of property. This endowment, established by royal decree, was essentially a charitable foundation for the king's soul. It could include vast tracts of the most fertile agricultural land in Egypt, entire towns and the serfs who lived and worked in them, fleets of fishing boats on the Nile, large herds of cattle, flocks of geese, sprawling vineyards, and specialized workshops. The endowment might also include the rights to the income from specific turquoise mines in the Sinai, gold mines in Nubia, or a percentage of the profits from royal trade expeditions to foreign lands. These diverse lands and enterprises were managed by an army of scribes and administrators under the authority of the mortuary temple's high priest, who was himself a powerful and influential figure. This vast agricultural and economic machine generated a perpetual stream of revenue. The grain harvested from the temple fields, the wine pressed in its vineyards, the cattle from its herds, all flowed into the temple's storehouses. This income was used to directly supply the offering table of the dead king, as well as to pay the salaries of the temple staff, and to fund the maintenance and expansion of the temple complex itself. This system, replicated by pharaoh after pharaoh, had a profound and lasting impact on the Egyptian economy. A significant and ever-increasing portion of the nation's total wealth and productive capacity was progressively locked away into these tax-exempt religious foundations. With each successive king building his own mansion of millions of years and endowing it with its own permanent source of income, more and more of Egypt's economic lifeblood was funneled into the service of the dead. This could, at times, place an immense strain on the living state, especially during periods of weak central rule. The great mortuary temples, with their vast independent wealth and legions of dependents, could become more powerful and influential than the reigning pharaoh himself. The dead kings were, in a very real and tangible sense, in direct economic competition with their living successors, their ghostly hands reaching out from the past to control the wealth of the present. After the food had been spiritually consumed by the ka of the deceased king during the offering ritual, it did not go to waste. It underwent a magical and practical process known as the reversion of offerings. The physical food, now devoid of its spiritual essence, sekhem, but still perfectly edible, was taken from the king's altar and represented at the secondary altars of other gods housed within the temple, and then at the altars of the king's deceased family members who were also venerated there. After they had all had their turn, the offerings were finally distributed amongst the temple staff, from the high priest down to the janitors and farmers, as their payment in kind. A position as a priest in a major royal mortuary cult was therefore a highly lucrative, prestigious, and sought-after job. It came with a guaranteed high-quality food supply for one's family, a share in the temple's vast wealth, significant social standing, and often a beautiful house within the temple precinct. These positions inevitably became hereditary, creating a privileged and powerful class of families whose entire livelihood, identity, and social position were inextricably tied to the service of a king who had died centuries or even millennia earlier. The pharaoh's influence also extended beyond the formal cult, deep into the private lives and eternal hopes of his subjects, particularly the elite officials who had served him in life. A courtier's greatest aspiration for his own eternal life was to be buried near his king. In the Old Kingdom, the tombs of the high officials, the solid bench-like mastabas, formed a neat grid-like necropolis, a city of the dead, surrounding the king's gleaming pyramid. They were like eternal suburbs orbiting the divine center. To be granted a burial plot in this sacred space was the ultimate sign of royal favor, a gift from the king himself. The official's tomb would be filled with inscriptions and reliefs detailing his loyal service to the king, his impressive titles, and his privileged proximity to the royal person. The underlying hope was that by being physically close to the king's powerful resurrection machine, some of its potent divine energy would rub off on them, aiding their own much smaller scale journey into the afterlife. They would literally ride the king's celestial coattails into eternity. This proximity was not just physical, but also spiritual and economic. The officials would petition the king for the right to an offering which the king gives, or the Hetepdi Nesu formula. This was a legal and religious formula, inscribed prominently on their tomb walls and stelae, that allowed them to magically tap into the immense surplus of the king's own vast offering cult. The formula essentially stated that the king, as the sole intermediary with the great gods, was giving a portion of his divine offerings to his loyal servant. The dead official was thus able to piggyback on the dead king's eternal catering service, ensuring he would never go hungry or thirsty in the afterlife. This created a powerful and deeply ingrained bond of loyalty. Serving the king well and faithfully in this life was the only surefire way to ensure that he would take care of you in the next. But the dead pharaoh was not just a passive, abstract recipient of offerings. In the popular religion of the people, he was an active, powerful, and often approachable supernatural agent, a new god who could be prayed to and petitioned by the living. He became a kind of divine intercessor, a celestial middleman. If a person was suffering from a debilitating illness, a bitter legal dispute, or the sorrow of infertility, they might make a pilgrimage to the dead king's mortuary temple, or to a public shrine dedicated to him. There, they would leave a small offering of food or flowers and a written prayer on a scrap of pottery, an ostrakon, or a small stone stele, asking the deified king to intervene on their behalf with the great distant cosmic gods like Osiris, Ra, or Thoth. The dead king, having once been human, was seen as more approachable, more understanding of human troubles, and more intimately connected to the human realm than the awesome and sometimes intimidating great gods of the state pantheon. Some pharaohs became incredibly popular local saints, their cults flourishing for centuries after their deaths. The New Kingdom pharaoh Amenhotep I and his mother, Queen Ahmose Nefertari, were venerated for generations at Thebes as the divine patrons of the village of Deir el-Medina, the special community of artisans who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The villagers prayed to them for help with everything from scorpion stings and workplace accidents to nightmares and disputes with their neighbors. Their painted images adorned household shrines, and festivals in their honor were among the most important events in the village's calendar. The king's death did not remove him from his people. In many ways, it made him more accessible, more useful, and more intimately involved in their daily lives than he had ever been when he was alive, locked away in the splendid isolation of his palace. He had become a permanent, divine fixture in the spiritual and economic landscape of Egypt, a dead god whose business was very much alive. We have followed the pharaoh through a life of cosmic burden, through the strange bonds of his divine family, into the gilded cage of his palace, and down into the golden, silent darkness of his tomb. We have witnessed the vast, eternal corporation he established to feed his spirit. But all of these practices, from sacred incest to mummification, were part of a system designed to function perfectly, to uphold Ma'at for all time. This system, however, was predicated on a single, critical assumption that it would last forever. But eternity is a long time, and the meticulously constructed world of the pharaoh was vulnerable to the two great forces that unravel all human endeavors: greed and chaos. The story of the pharaohs is also the story of the spectacular failure of their eternal plans, a tale of tomb robbers, heretic kings, and the slow, inevitable decay of divinity. The first and most immediate threat to a pharaoh's eternal rest was a purely human one: robbery. The sheer, unimaginable wealth sealed within the royal tombs was a temptation that few could resist. The king's house of eternity, designed to be his fortress for millions of years, was also a treasure chest, the largest and most concentrated store of portable wealth in the entire ancient world. It was a giant, gleaming target in the desert. While the great pyramids of the Old Kingdom, with their immense size and complex internal passages, were designed to be impregnable, not a single one of them escaped being plundered in antiquity. The robbers were not common thieves. They were often highly organized, well-equipped gangs who likely possessed inside information, perhaps from the very artisans who built the tombs or corrupt officials charged with guarding the necropolis. Surviving court documents from the late New Kingdom, particularly the famous tomb robbery papyri, paint a vivid picture of this illicit industry. They record the trials of gangs who were caught and interrogated, their confessions extracted under torture. One papyrus details the confession of a stonemason named Amenphanafer, who, in the reign of Ramesses IX, broke into the pyramid of the 13th dynasty, King Sobekemsaf II. He and his accomplices spent days tunneling through the pyramid's core with their copper tools. He describes their final breakthrough into the burial chamber. "We found the god lying at the back of his burial place, and we found the burial place of Queen Nubkas, his queen, situated beside him. We opened their sarcophagi and their coffins in which they were. We found the noble mummy of this king equipped with a falcon. A large number of amulets and jewels of gold were upon his neck, and his headpiece of gold was upon him. The noble mummy of this king was completely bedecked with gold, and his coffins were adorned with gold and silver inside and out, and inlaid with all kinds of precious stones." The confession continues with a cold, almost business-like description of their work. "We collected the gold which we found on the noble mummy of this god, and we collected all that we found on her, the queen, likewise. We set fire to their coffins. We took their furniture, which we found with them, consisting of articles of gold, silver, and bronze, and we divided them amongst ourselves. This was not just theft, it was a profound act of sacrilege. They stripped the gods of their divine equipment, melted down the golden skin of the deities for bullion, and burned their sacred coffins for fuel. In doing so, they were not just robbing the king of his wealth, they were robbing him of his eternal life. Without his protective amulets, his golden mask, and his inscribed coffin, the pharaoh's spirit was left naked, vulnerable, and lost in the underworld. The robbers were effectively murdering the king for a second time. This problem became so rampant by the end of the New Kingdom that the priests of Amun at Thebes took a desperate and extraordinary step. Under the cover of darkness, they systematically entered the old, desecrated tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They gathered up the battered and plundered royal mummies of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, including legends like Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramesses the Great himself. They rewrapped the bodies, placed them in simple replacement coffins, and labeled them with dockets identifying who they were. Then, to protect them from any future violation, they moved them all into a series of secret, hidden caches. The most famous of these, known as the Deir el-Bahri Royal Cache, DB 320, was a simple, undecorated tomb hidden in the cliffs near Hatshepsut's temple. Here, the bodies of over 50 of Egypt's most powerful kings and queens lay huddled together in a dusty, crowded anonymity for 3,000 years, until their chance rediscovery in the 19th century. The grand project of the individual House of Eternity had failed so completely that the only solution was to hide the gods in a mass, unmarked grave. But the threats were not always external. Sometimes, the greatest danger came from the pharaoh's own successors. While the system was designed for continuity, occasionally a king would come to the throne who sought not to continue the traditions of his ancestors, but to shatter them. The most radical and bizarre example of this was the 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who became Akhenaten. Ascending the throne in a time of unprecedented wealth and power, Akhenaten instigated a religious revolution that shook Egypt to its core. He rejected the entire pantheon of traditional Egyptian gods, Amun-Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, who had been worshipped for millennia. He declared that there was only one true god, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun, the source of all light and life. This was a seismic shift in Egyptian thought. Akhenaten closed down the ancient temples of the other gods, particularly the immensely powerful and wealthy temples of Amun-Ra at Thebes. He dispatched workers to chisel out the name of Amun from monuments all across Egypt, an act of iconoclasm designed to literally erase the god from existence. He moved the entire capital of Egypt from Thebes to a brand new virgin city he built in the middle of the desert, a place called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, modern-day Amarna. Here, he created a new art style, a strange and sometimes unsettling naturalism that depicted the royal family not as idealized, perfect gods, but with elongated skulls, sagging bellies, and spindly limbs. In this new religion, Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, were the sole intermediaries between humanity and the Aten. There was no Osiris, no underworld, no complex afterlife journey. One's hope for eternity now lay solely in the continued favor of the living king. This revolution, while perhaps a fascinating intellectual experiment, was a direct assault on the eternal corporations of his dead ancestors. By closing their temples and ceasing their offering cults, Akhenaten was effectively starving his own forefathers in the afterlife. He was pulling the plug on their resurrection machines. To the majority of Egyptians, this was a terrifying heresy, an act of supreme arrogance that threatened to unravel Ma'at itself. The backlash, when it came, was swift and total. Shortly after Akhenaten's death, his son, Tutankhamun, was placed on the throne. Under the guidance of the old priests and officials, he immediately abandoned the city of Akhetaten, moved the court back to Thebes, and formally restored the worship of the old gods. The temples of Amun were reopened and lavishly refurbished, and then the revenge of the old gods began. Akhenaten's memory was officially condemned, his name was hacked out of king lists, his statues were smashed, his buildings dismantled, and his new city was abandoned to the desert sands, its stones repurposed for other projects. He became the criminal of Akhetaten, that enemy, a heretic whose very existence was to be forgotten. His elaborate tomb at Amarna was desecrated. For centuries, he was deliberately written out of Egyptian history. This was the ultimate failure for a pharaoh. His name, the very anchor of his identity, was erased. His mortuary cult was extinguished. His eternal corporation was bankrupted. His house of eternity demolished. He was condemned not just to death, but to non-existence, the worst possible fate an Egyptian could imagine. The system, designed to ensure immortality, had turned on itself and devoured one of its own. It was a stark lesson that even a god-king could not unilaterally change the traditions upon which his own divinity rested. The forces of eternity were more powerful than any single pharaoh. We have traced the pharaoh's bizarre and magnificent journey from the cradle to the grave and deep into the afterlife. We have seen him as a cosmic fulcrum supporting the heavens, a divine prisoner in a gilded palace, the meticulous architect of his own eternal afterlife, and finally, as a vulnerable figure whose carefully laid plans for millions of years could be undone by the simple greed of human hands and the revolutionary fervor of his own kin. Now in this final chapter, we must bear witness to the long, slow, and inexorable twilight of this entire cosmos. For the world of the pharaoh, which seemed so permanent, so absolute, so rooted in the very bedrock of creation, did eventually end. Its decline was not a single, dramatic event, a thunderclap of sudden collapse. It was a gradual erosion, a slow, creeping dissolution, like a magnificent sandstone statue worn down by millennia of wind and sand. It was the story of a foundation cracking under its own immense weight, succumbing to the relentless pressures of foreign invasion, economic exhaustion, and the quiet, insidious rise of new ideas that would ultimately render the god-king obsolete and turn his eternal houses into silent ruins. The beginning of the end can be traced not to an external enemy, but to a sickness within. The late New Kingdom, following the reign of the last great warrior pharaoh, Ramesses III, who had bankrupted the state fighting off the mysterious invasion of the Sea Peoples. saw a slow hemorrhaging of royal authority. A succession of weaker kings, all bearing the hallowed name of Ramesses, found their power increasingly overshadowed by the colossal and ever-growing economic and political might of the priesthood of the state god, Amun-Ra, at Thebes. This was the logical, perhaps inevitable, outcome of centuries of pharaohs endowing the temples with vast, tax-exempt estates. The servants of the god had become richer and more powerful than the living god himself. This creeping decay is perfectly captured in a remarkable document that survived by chance, the Tale of Wenamun. It tells the story of an official from the temple of Amun sent to the Phoenician city of Byblos to procure cedar wood for the god's sacred bark. A century or two earlier, such a request would have been a royal command instantly obeyed. But Wenamun is treated with contempt. He is robbed, stranded, and openly mocked by the local prince of Byblos, who tells him, "I am not your servant, nor the servant of him who sent you." The story is a stunning, first-hand account of the complete collapse of Egyptian prestige abroad. The divine aura of the pharaoh no longer inspired fear or respect beyond Egypt's borders. This internal weakness soon metastasized into a full-blown political schism. Around 1070 BCE, the nation fractured. Egypt, the two lands, once united under a single divine ruler, now split into two separate entities. In the north, a line of pharaohs ruled from the city of Tanis in the Nile Delta. In the south, the vast and wealthy territory around Thebes became a de facto theocratic state, controlled by the high priests of Amun, who took on kingly titles and ruled as virtual monarchs in their own right. The unified divine authority of the pharaoh, the very foundation of his cosmic power, was irrevocably broken. The central pillar of Ma'at now had a crack running right down the middle, and through that crack, the forces of chaos began to seep. A weakened and divided Egypt became a prize for ambitious neighbors. For the first time in centuries, foreigners came not as humble traders or tribute bearers, but as conquerors. First came a dynasty of Libyan chieftains, men whose ancestors had been hired as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. They assimilated, grew powerful, and eventually, one of their leaders, Shoshenq took the throne, establishing the 22nd dynasty. They were followed by an invasion from the south, from the kingdom of Kush in what is now Sudan. For centuries, Nubia had been a subjugated Egyptian colony, its people considered a source of slaves, soldiers, and gold. Now, the roles were reversed. The powerful Nubian kings, seeing themselves as more culturally conservative and pious than the decadent Libyans, marched north, conquering Egypt and establishing themselves as the 25th dynasty. These Nubian pharaohs, like Paye and Taharqa, deeply respected and ardently adopted the traditions of pharaonic kingship. They built pyramids for their burials back in Nubia, commissioned magnificent temples in the Egyptian style, and presented themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as restorers of traditional Egyptian values. Yet their very presence created a deep ideological paradox. How could the pharaoh be a unique Egyptian god, the incarnation of Horus, the living embodiment of the Egyptian soil, if he was a black-skinned Nubian from a land that had always been considered foreign and inferior? The sacred, unbroken bloodline, so carefully guarded by millennia of sacred incest, had been definitively severed, replaced by the pragmatic and brutal reality of military power. Divinity was becoming less about inherent nature and more about successful performance. These regional power struggles were soon rendered moot by the arrival of true imperial superpowers. The first hammer blow came from the mighty Neo-Assyrian Empire. Armed with superior iron weapons and a ruthlessly efficient war machine, the Assyrians swept down from Mesopotamia. In 664 BCE, they did the unthinkable. They marched all the way to southern Egypt and brutally sacked the ancient sacred city of Thebes. The home of Amun-Ra, the religious heart of the empire for over 1,000 years, was plundered, its temples desecrated, its people slaughtered or deported. The psychological shock to the Egyptian worldview was profound. The biblical prophet Nahum captured the horror felt across the ancient world. "Are you better than Thebes?" he taunted the Assyrians, "that was situated by the Nile, whose rampart was the sea, whose wall was the water. Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was infinite. Yet she was carried away, she went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed in pieces at the head of all the streets." The Assyrians were eventually driven out, but they were soon replaced by an even greater power, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The emperor Cambyses II conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, and this time the occupation stuck. The Persian king now adopted the title of pharaoh, but he was an absentee landlord, ruling from a distant capital in Persepolis, or Susa. The pharaoh was no longer a god walking the banks of the Nile, performing the daily rituals to keep the cosmos in balance. He was now a line on a bureaucrat's ledger, a name on a tax roll. Egypt, for the first time in its long history, had become a mere province, a satrapy in someone else's empire. The arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE marked another profound and dizzying shift. Hailed by the Egyptians as a liberator from the hated Persians, the brilliant young Macedonian was a political genius. Understanding the deep-seated need for a legitimate, God-approved ruler, he made a perilous journey across the desert to the remote Siwa oasis, home to a famous oracle of the god Amun. There, the priests greeted him as the son of the god. This was a masterstroke of public relations, a declaration that legitimized his rule in the eyes of the Egyptian priesthood and populace by directly connecting him to both the pharaonic tradition of divine sonship and, through the Greek identification of Amun with Zeus, to his own Hellenistic divine heritage. After Alexander's untimely death, his general Ptolemy seized control of Egypt, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty that would last for 3 centuries. This new line of rulers were ethnically and culturally Greek Macedonians. They spoke Greek, fostered Greek learning, and built the magnificent new capital of Alexandria into the intellectual and cultural center of the Hellenistic world, complete with its legendary library and lighthouse. Yet to their Egyptian subjects outside of Alexandria, they presented a completely different face. They poured vast resources into building breathtaking new temples in the pure, traditional Egyptian style at places like Edfu, Dendera, and Philae. On the walls of these temples, we see the Ptolemaic kings and their famous queens, including the last of their line, Cleopatra VII, depicted in full pharaonic regalia. They are shown wearing the double crown, making offerings to Horus and Isis, smiting Egypt's enemies, their names written in sacred hieroglyphs inside royal cartouches. It was a brilliant and largely successful dual identity, a carefully maintained masquerade, but it was a performance. The Ptolemaic rulers were patrons of the Egyptian religion, not its living heart. They were cynical pragmatists, not divine beings. The old beliefs were still practiced, the rituals still funded, but the central, animating force, the absolute, literal divinity of the king, had become a useful political fiction rather than a fundamental cosmic truth. The final decisive act came with the arrival of Rome. After the fleet of Cleopatra and her Roman lover, Mark Antony, was defeated at the Battle of Actium, the victorious Octavian, soon to be the Emperor Augustus, absorbed Egypt into the Roman Empire in 30 BCE. But the Romans did not even bother with the fiction of pharaonic rule. For Augustus, Egypt was something new, different, and far more valuable. It was his personal breadbasket, a vast private estate whose immense grain wealth was essential to feed the restive population of the city of Rome and thus maintain his own power. The emperor was not a pharaoh, he was the owner. Egypt was ruled not by a god-king, but by a Roman prefect, an equestrian-class governor who reported directly and only to the emperor. The divine office of pharaoh, an institution that had endured for 3,000 years, was not violently overthrown. It was simply left vacant, like an abandoned throne in a dusty room. It ceased to exist. With the central pillar of the old religion now gone, the entire ancient structure began to wither. The great temples continued to function for a time under Roman supervision, but their economic and political power was shattered, and a new faith was quietly spreading along the Nile, carried by missionaries and merchants. A faith that offered a radically different and deeply compelling vision of God, humanity, and the afterlife. Christianity, with its message of a single, universal and transcendent God, and a personal salvation available to all people, rich or poor, Egyptian or Greek, through faith in a Messiah who had suffered and died as a man, was fundamentally incompatible with the old pharaonic worldview. A Christian could not believe that the Roman emperor was a god, nor that a long-dead pharaoh in a distant tomb required offerings of bread and beer to survive. The new religion offered a direct, personal relationship with the divine, with no need for a pharaoh or a complex priestly hierarchy as an intermediary. The end was now a matter of time. It came slowly, inexorably, village by village. In 392 CE, the devoutly Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius III issued a series of decrees that outlawed pagan practices and ordered the closure of all pagan temples throughout the empire. The last priests were driven from the ancient sanctuaries of Karnak and Philae. The sacred fires on the ancient altars, which had burned for millennia, were extinguished. The daily offerings to the dead kings and the great gods, the very fuel that powered the Egyptian cosmos, ceased. The intricate, beautiful, and sacred art of writing hieroglyphs, the words of the god, fell out of use, its complex secrets forgotten for over 1400 years until the chance discovery of the Rosetta Stone. The millennia-long conversation between the living and the dead pharaohs fell into an unbreakable silence. The great mortuary temples, deprived of their income and their purpose, were abandoned to the desert. Their massive stones were quarried for new churches and fortifications. Their serene statues were toppled and smashed as pagan idols. Their sacred sanctuaries were sometimes converted into Coptic churches or monasteries, with Christian saints painted over the images of the ancient gods. The houses of eternity, once the most sacred places on earth, became objects of fear and superstition, haunted ruins filled with the ghosts of forgotten deities. The story of the pharaoh was over. What was left was a landscape of majestic ruins, a silent testament to a belief system of breathtaking ambition and profound strangeness. The god-kings who had spent lifetimes and fortunes building their launch pads to eternity found themselves grounded, their spirits unfed, their eternal corporations bankrupt. Their mummified bodies, once the most sacred and powerful objects on earth, became mere curiosities. In the centuries to come, they would be ground into a powder called mumia, sold as a quack medicine in European apothecaries, or publicly unwrapped at fashionable high society parties in Victorian London. The ultimate indignity had been achieved. The weird, complex, and all-encompassing world of the pharaoh had not lasted for millions of years. It had simply faded into history, leaving behind only the enigmatic smile of a golden mask, and the long, silent, and indifferent shadow of a pyramid against the setting sun. And so, the story ends. The great river of pharaonic history, which flowed for 3,000 years, finally empties into the vast, silent sea of the past. We have walked with gods and watched their power turn to dust. We have seen eternity planned for, paid for, and then lost to the slow, inevitable creep of time. The world they built was one of the strangest and most enduring we have ever known, a civilization utterly convinced that a single human being was the linchpin of the entire cosmos, a world where death was not an end, but a doorway to a new and dangerous job, where the purest love was that of a brother for his sister, where the business of forever was the most important work of the living. It is easy to look back now and see only the strangeness, the animal-headed gods, the gilded mummies, the impossible pyramids, but beneath it all was a profoundly human desire, one that we can still recognize, the desperate need to believe that there is order in the chaos, that our lives have meaning, and that something of us, something important, will survive after we are gone. The pharaohs are gone now. Their voices are silent, their temples are ruins, but their story reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and facts. It is a journey into other ways of being human. It is a look into a mirror, where we can see our own fears, our own hopes, and our own mortality reflected in the serene, golden face of a long-dead king. Thank you for listening.